Good evening and namaskar everyone. I am Srijuni representing Voices from the Periphery. It is a privilege and an honor to extend a warm and heartfelt welcome to each one of you to today's lecture, Aeroplane and the Making of Modern India. We are truly delighted and deeply humbled to have with us this evening the eminent academic and scholar Dr. Aashique Ahmed Iqbal. He is a historian specializing in modern South Asia with a particular focus on the intersections of technology, politics, and culture. He serves as an assistant professor of history at Krea University in Andhra Pradesh, India. His academic journey has been supported by several prestigious scholarships, including the Felix Scholarship, the Royal Historical Society Fellowship, and the Maulana Azad National Fellowship. Dr. Iqbal's research delves into the role of aviation in India's transition from a British colony to a sovereign republic. His book, The Aeroplane and the Making of Modern India, published by the Oxford University Press in 2023, examines how aviation influenced state formation, military strategy, and national identity in mid 20th century India. He argues that aviation was pivotal in shaping India's sovereignty, especially during critical periods such as the Second World War, the Partition, and the early years of independence. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Iqbal contributes to public discourse through articles and platforms like India Forum, EPW Engage, and Teacher Plus. He also engages in public lectures, such as his recent talk titled The Aeroplane and the End of the British Raj, hosted by the RAF Museum, where he discussed the origins and evolution of the Indian Air Force during and after World War II. Currently, Dr. Iqbal is exploring the impact of aviation on leisure travel in South Asia, investigating its cultural, economic, and environmental implications. His interdisciplinary approach encompasses transport history, business history, science, and technology studies, warfare, and state formation, contributing significantly to our understanding of how technological advancements intersect with societal transformations. We are honored by his presence with us this evening, and we look forward to having an enlightening and thought provoking session. Thank you. Over to you, sir.
All right. Thank you. You're able to just very quickly. If I change the slide, you're able to see is the slide moving? Yes.
Yes, sir. It is moving.
Okay, great.
Yes,
so I don't have any sort of vision here in the sense of what you're able to see. So please let me know if there are any issues either with the slides or with with sound. But I'll just very quickly tell you the story that my book is about. Right. Nobody has really worked on the history of the aeroplane so far, at least not at this level. There have been works by people who are interested in the various sort of military aspects in terms of operations and things like that. People who are interested in part in the princes, but there's not been a very serious academic attempt to put together the overall story of civil and military aviation at this point in time. So that's what my book does. You can sort of see the cover over here. It's on the left. It's called The Aeroplane and the Making of Modern India. Our story starts, in the 1930s, right? This is the time when Indians begin to get into aviation. You can probably recognize the guy in the middle of this image is J.R.P. Tata. He's the guy with the goggles, on his T-shirt. In his famous 1932 flight, from Karachi via Ahmedabad to Bombay. It was an airmail carrying flight. You can probably see a bag of airmail, on the ground to the left. So basically, Tata was a sort of visionary industrialist, wanted to establish an Indian airline. Didn't receive much by way of support from the British Raj to do this. The British were not particularly keen on supporting Indian aviation. So essentially, he was able to sort of do this on a shoestring budget. One of the fun facts about this particular journey is that at Ahmedabad, there was no real sort of refueling facility. So the oil was brought in a bullock cart to fuel the aeroplane you can sort of see in the background. So basically in the 1930s, Indian civil aviation was not doing particularly well. In this image, you can see Indian military aviation, right? So the Indian Air Force was established around the same time. It depends on how you sort of date it. It was sort of started off in 1931, but like essentially raised in 1932. Irrelevant. The wider point is that essentially the Indian Air Force was established by the British for one very simple reason. And that had to do with the fact that they were not particularly keen on putting Indians in the British Air Force, right? Now, Indian political leaders were deeply concerned about India's lack of air defenses. They knew that if there was a war, especially a world war, India would have to defend itself in the skies, and it was very likely that the British Royal Air Force would be withdrawn. Nevertheless, when they asked for Indians to be put into the Royal Air Force, the British Royal Air Force, the British refused. Initially, they only wanted to set up a very, very small Indian Air Force with about 4 planes, but they realized it was too expensive to do that, so they established a single squadron, which they called the Indian Air Force. So the Indian Air Force, of course, was equipped with really, really bad aircraft. The aeroplane you see in this image is something called the Westland Wapiti, first aeroplane of the Indian Air Force. Westland Wapiti was called, the British themselves called the Westland Wapiti the water pity aeroplane, because it was very slow, it was very old. It did not incidentally have a radio. Many of the sort of variants of it that were provided to the IAF did not initially at least have radios. So when they took off in the skies, they often sort of did so carrying a pigeon, which was then sort of thrown out of the aeroplane to send messages back to the ground. So you can imagine what kind of backward aircraft this was. Now, so military aviation, in addition to civil aviation, was not really obviously prioritized by the colonial state, by the British in India. But all of that was going to change. And that's where my book begins, its first chapter, with the Second World War, right? So the Second World War basically sees a massive expansion of Indian aerodromes, right? Like the thing that Indian, military and civil aviation was demanding was more aerodromes. The government was not really willing to sort of do that initially, but once the war broke out, and especially after India had to host air forces from the US as well as Britain in order to fight the Japanese on India's own borders. In places like Assam, hundreds of aerodromes were set up, something like 400 aerodromes were set up, built by around 2 million people, who you can sort of see in this image, over here. The problem with this particular approach in certain ways to aviation was that it was carried out in a rather rushed manner, right? So even though there were many aerodromes were built, even though the Indian Air Force was expanded from 1 squadron to 9 squadrons by the end of the war and 10 squadrons by 1946, in practice, there were very serious issues. So the Indian Air Force did very, very well in the war. The Indian Air Force performed excellently well. It received a lot of medals. It was given the title Royal Indian Air Force, right? So from 1945 to 1947, maybe actually 1945 to 1950, I think the Indian Air Force was called the Royal Indian Air Force in recognition for its brave deeds during the war. These deeds included things like basically sort of tactical reconnaissance, which is where aeroplanes are sent out to find the enemy, as well as things like dive bombing, which is a very dangerous job where aircraft are made to bomb enemy positions while essentially almost crashing, but then pulling out of a crash at the last moment to drop the bombs. So the IF did very well, but in practice, the expansion was rushed, and that rushed expansion was going to have, very serious consequences. There weren't enough personnel to serve in the IF, because increasingly war was going to be highly technological, highly scientific. You needed sort of well-trained, well-educated men to fly these aircraft, and they were not easily found in a country like India, where the government had not invested very heavily in education. There were also, at least in the first years of the war, very serious shortages of aircraft. So Indians always received the worst aircraft, and they always received the newest aircraft last, right? So these problems with expansion, would cause, all manner of issues in the Indian Air Force, and culminate in a series of strikes in 1946, where Indian Air Force men would demand better working conditions. But overall, the Second World War is the foundation for Indian aviation, because even civil aviation benefited immensely from from the Second World War, because it was able to sort of, after the war, get a lot of skilled pilots who were sort of released from military service. It was able to buy cheap aeroplanes, which the Americans were willing to sell at a very discounted price. So it is only after this war where the Indian Air Force increases tenfold, where the Indian airlines after the war become more profitable, more viable overall, that the Indian aviation sector can be said to truly have emerged, right? But of course, the Indian aviation sector emerged into a political situation which we can mildly describe as undesirable, right? In 1946-47, India was essentially going through its partition, and that's what I talk about in my second chapter, Ittihad Mein Shakti. So this is an image, a very interesting image of essentially Indian Independence Day, right? At the bottom of the image, you can see Indian Air Force personnel. It's a sepia image, but it's not hard for you to imagine them wearing, their lovely blue uniforms. In the middle of the image is the Red Fort, a place from which Indian prime ministers until this day, deliver the address of sort of Independence Day. And above it, you can see these huge, four-engined bomber aircraft. Fun fact about this day, firstly, those bomber aircraft were not Indian. Those were British aircraft, almost certainly, because the Indian Air Force did not have such heavy aircraft at the time. But also in this very parade, there were various other, there were other sort of pilots, including pilots who were on their way to sort of Pakistan. Once the Indian Air Force was being divided, right? So the Indian Air Force was like the Army and the Navy, divided between India and Pakistan. Men who had fought together in World War II were now going to sort of join, different air forces. There was a lot of quarrel between the governments of India and Pakistan as to who would receive, how many squadrons and what the logic for that divide would be. So it was an incredibly difficult and painful time. As you can imagine, the kind of disorganization that splitting the Indian Air Force would cause was immense and difficult. But it was not only a difficult time for the IAF; it was a difficult time for the country as a whole. Right? This is an image taken from an aeroplane, possibly an IAF aeroplane, of essentially refugees traveling from India to Pakistan and vice versa, an aeroplane sort of flying over them, taking that photo. Now, around 14 million people, I think, made the journey. Muslims leaving India, heading to Pakistan, non-Muslims, basically Hindus and Sikhs, making the journey from Pakistan to India. The thing about this is that nobody had meaningfully planned partition, right? Partition was not something that the leaderships of either the Muslim League or the Congress, which were going to be the governments of these countries, had meaningfully thought about. So when it did happen, it came as a surprise, right? Why was it a surprise in you ask? Well, quite simply, it was unthinkable that the farmers of Punjab, the Sikh farmers of Punjab, would leave the land that had been in their homes in their families for generations, especially when you consider land as the most vital asset for farmers. It was also unthinkable that the Muslims of Delhi, who had lived in the city for centuries, would leave it, just because of some violence. But of course, partition turned out to be so violent that people did decide to sort of have to move country, and this led to what has euphemistically been called the transfer of populations. The transfer of populations, of course, was incredibly difficult and had to be carried out. Out of the 14 million people who sort of were evacuated, less than 50,000, according to my calculations, is no clear-cut number, were really sort of lifted by air. Traveling by air was incredibly difficult. People would camp in airports. There were very high costs to air tickets. One estimate is about 400 rupees in air ticket, which is a huge amount at that point in time. You could only carry a very small amount of. You could only carry two suitcases. I think it might have been 10 to 15 kilos. So it was really, really difficult to travel, by air. And the people who did travel by air, however, did so very quickly, right? Like once you got into an aeroplane, it was very difficult to get into an aeroplane. But once you got into an aeroplane, you basically escaped all the problems that the people on the ground were facing, right? Like you can see the images of people making that journey in bullock carts or making that journey, by walk, and this was at the peak of scorching sort of North Indian summers. So the fact that people could essentially make this journey by aeroplane, that helped them a lot. But who are the people who are flying by aeroplane? Uh, Mostly a combination of rich people and government officials. And those government officials are some of the most important people in these two countries, right? So some of them were government officials who are going to basically be the government of Pakistan, many of whom had their homes in Delhi. So transferring them to Pakistan was really important to organize the movement of people into Pakistan. Uh, on the other hand, it was also important to move a lot of the people who were going to be the government of Punjab, like the state of Punjab. It wasn't initially Punjab in India, but what had been the state of Punjab. It was important to move that bureaucracy to India. And those people were, mostly in what would become West Pakistan. Right? If you look at map of Punjab, you see that most of Punjab ended up going to Pakistan. So most of these people were based in cities like Lahore. So they had to be basically moved to Delhi or Amritsar, and aeroplanes played a pretty important role over there. Right? Like so, essentially, a lot of people end up being moved in that sense, and these are the people who will organize the movement of people on the ground. Right? So that's a really important thing. Another important thing which aeroplanes did was that they basically sort of provided cholera medication. Something between 200,000 and 2 million people died in partition, huge numbers, even at the lower end of the spectrum. But those numbers would have been much larger if there had been an outbreak of cholera, especially given how unsanitary the conditions of the camps in which refugees were. Very little by way of toilets, very little by way of disposable places where you can dispose dead bodies. So the fact that essentially aircraft moved cholera medication, especially the fact that aircraft were able to move cholera medication probably prevented the deaths of millions of people. Finally, the Indian Air Force played an important role in basically flying through riot-affected areas to restore order. This could serve a number of purposes. One purpose it could serve was basically to sort of tell ground troops, what was happening. So they could, for instance, spot if gangs of rioters were waiting to attack a train, or waiting to attack a village, or waiting to attack a column of refugees. That was something that aeroplanes could do. But the much more important effect, perhaps, was the fact that the very return of aeroplanes indicated a return of the state, a return of law and order, a return of the ability of the state to restore order. And in many places, just the arrival of aeroplanes meant that riots, ceased. Right? This is quite, it's quite poignantly, quite poignantly narrated to us in the novel Tamas, right? Tamas, a famous Partition novel, which was also turned into a famous series on DD1. So in Tamas, a Sikh Gurudwara is under attack by Muslims, but once an aeroplane, flies over the village, the rioters immediately disperse because they know that the aeroplane signifies the return of the government, the return of state order, and that if you resist the aeroplane, you are likely to soon be resisting other things, right? So basically, aircraft were quite crucial. Even though the Indian Air Force was going through a division of its own, it played a pretty important role, as did Indian civil aviation, in terms of helping people during partition. The number of people helped was tiny, but those people were very significant, and we must not underestimate how important aircraft were in restoring order. This is incidentally, the squadron motto, and coat of arms, the heraldry of the number one squadron, the first squadron established by the Indian Air Force. It was called Air Squadron Number One, and as you can see, its motto was "Ittihad mein Shakti hai," which is translated to "There is strength in unity." Ittihad's an Urdu word. Shakti is a sort of Sanskritized Hindu word. After partition, number one squadron was basically sort of divided. Its Hindu component or its sort of Indian component largely ended up being um, disbanded until the 1950s because the Pakistanis basically disbanded the squadron which they ended up receiving, number one squadron. Number one squadron would eventually be re-raised, but when it was re-raised, its motto would no longer be Ittihad mein Shakti hai, its motto would be Ekta mein Shakti hai. So make of that what you will. My third chapter looks at how the very men who had served together in Burma now increasingly served in rival air forces, the air forces of India and Pakistan. There was, as you know, a huge conflict in Jammu and Kashmir. Um, my argument is very simple with regard to aviation. I say that aviation helped initiate, sustain, and eventually escalate the conflict. What do I mean by that? Well, aircraft helped start the war. Right. Now, the Pakistani plan, was quite simply to overrun Jammu and Kashmir through its tribal proxies, but to overrun Jammu and Kashmir rapidly in the winter months and essentially cut Indian access to the region off. Right. That didn't end up happening because India was able to mobilize aircraft. India was able to mobilize a lot of civilian aircraft. If you look at the first image over here, you can see you can see sort of a bus in the front, but you can see a big aeroplane in the back. That aeroplane is not an Indian Air Force aeroplane. That is a Dakota aeroplane, which were widely used by Indian sort of civil aviation operators. So India was actually able to so successfully and rapidly mobilize its civilian aircraft to serve a military purpose. That to this day, there are conspiracy theories in Pakistan that India was prepared to, intervene in Kashmir. No such thing is true, but the wider point is that, essentially these civil aircraft were very, very important to starting the war in Kashmir, to enabling India to sort of intervene over there. The war continued partly because India could use aeroplanes to make up for deficiencies that it had on the ground. Logistically, the Pakistanis had the advantage because they had better connected roads, easier lines of supply. So India was able to attack those lines of supply. It was able to basically keep its own troops supplied. The war itself was sustained and continued to be sustained thanks to the Indian Air Force. The use of the Indian Air Force was seen by India as a means of avoiding escalation. Right. This is a slightly complicated one, but let me try to put it simply. It was felt that instead of sending the army to certain places, using aircraft to attack those places might not necessarily change the battle lines, right? So that might basically indicate, as long as the Indian Air Force was used to strike precisely against enemy positions, that might prevent Pakistan from going into an all-out war. Right now, the war in Kashmir was a limited war. Both sides were trying desperately to avoid a war. If there had been a war at that point in time, there is no doubt it would have been devastating for both India and Pakistan because they were new countries. The economies were basically, not even really set up, and we cannot ignore the communal aspect, which is that a war, an all-out war between India and Pakistan would have meant the minorities in both countries would likely have faced a lot of violence. So both countries are trying to keep the war limited, trying to keep their forces from clashing with each other. And one of the core things in that, as I mentioned, was that India tried to use aeroplanes instead of soldiers. It was felt that was, aeroplanes were more precise. Aeroplanes could take photos of the places they had bombed. So it was not that the Pakistanis would retaliate to aeroplanes with an all-out attack with their army. But that is pretty much what happened by the end of 1948. Right? By the end of 1948, Pakistan concluded that India was trying to basically destroy it and that it had to go to an all-out war. So when Indian aircraft attacked a position at a town called Palak, that combined with some other Indian actions in other places convinced the Pakistanis that there might be a full-scale war, and they threatened to start a full-scale war, which is what essentially led to the ceasefire between India and Pakistan, which has essentially created the military line, which is the line between the Indian and Pakistani militaries, as well as which will eventually come to be called the line of control. But basically, the border between India and Pakistan is a border that was established by airplanes. Right, these are the furthest places that aircraft could go, and the role of airplanes in this particular conflict is something that we should not underestimate. Right, my fourth chapter. We move a little bit away from events, though we will actually come back to 1947-48. But and we move rather to looking at the princes, right? Now, I believe there were three forms of aviation in India in the 1940s. Um, there was civil aviation, there was military aviation, but there's also something which I choose to call princely aviation. So essentially, aviation as sponsored by the Indian princes. I look at three broad states when talking about aviation at this point in time. I look at Hyderabad, the richest state in India, Mysore, one of the most advanced states industrially, and Jodhpur. Jodhpur is what I'll focus on in today's talk. Happy to talk about the other two states in the Q&A if we'd like. But this is basically the Maharaja of Jodhpur, Maharaja His Highness Umaid Singh. You see him in two avatars. One is on the left as a traditional Rajput prince, wearing his sort of Rajput pagadi as well as his royal attire. And on the right, you see his avatar as Air Vice Marshal Sir Umaid Singh, Royal Air Force. So Umaid Singh was somebody who tried to combine Rajput valor with the modern appeal of aeroplanes, right? He basically trained at Cranwell, the Royal Air Force Academy, knew how to fly fighter aircraft. During World War II, he actually asked the British for permission to fly into battle. I think he would have loved nothing more than to fly fighter aircraft, perhaps against the Japanese. But the British refused, partly because his value as a king was far greater than his value as an individual fighter pilot. He was a great king, probably one of the best Jodhpur ever had. So basically, he was forced to sort of remain in ground duties. But during the Second World War, he performed a number of important duties. He spoke, he gave speeches, raised money for the Indian Air Force, raised recruits. He turned his own aerodrome, Jodhpur aerodrome, into an elementary flying training school.
Sir,
Yeah.
sir, I am sorry to interrupt, but the slides were not changing initially. We were stuck at the first slide. We could only see the first slide.
Okay, I asked you to tell me, right, like about it.
No, no, sir. Now it's changing. Now I
Now
can
it's
we can
now
see
it's
the slide.
changing. Yes.
Okay, so basically half the talk has been missed, I guess. Then I'll come back to the slides later, I suppose. Is it changing now?
Okay, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir. It is changing.
Okay. Please stop me if the slides aren't showing because I'm making use of the slides to talk, right? Like otherwise, you may not know what I'm talking about. So anyway, this is Maharaja Sir Umaid Singh, and he essentially was promoted by the British to the position of Air Vice Marshal in recognition to his services. He also, as you can you see this slide with the aeroplanes in the clouds and men with turbans standing below? Are you able to see this? Yes.
No, sir.
No, sir. No.
Okay. So what do I need? One second. I'll just.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Now we
Yes,
can see.
now, sir.
Now you can see it. Okay, one second. Let me come to okay. I'll just keep switching between these two, between these two images. So you can see the slide, right? So this is basically so Umaid Singh in the front, and Jodhpur royalty at the back, looking at his looking at aeroplanes at Jodhpur. So Umaid Singh sort of invested heavily in aeroplanes. My argument with regard to the kings is very simple. Like I say that so far the kings have their engagement with aeroplanes in works on the kings has always been portrayed as a kind of like luxury consumption, right? Like that these guys liked expensive, fast things, and aeroplanes are fast and expensive and glamorous. So that's why they invested in aircraft, right? But my argument is actually, the princes were much more serious about it, at least by the 20s and 30s, and certainly by the 40s. And they saw aeroplanes as a way to modernize their estates, as a way to back themselves up, especially because they were being questioned increasingly by by Indian nationalists who were saying that India has no place for kings, kings are outdated, and by the British government, which often said that these princes, they often refused to call them kings. The princes, were backward and represented some traditional version of India. Right? So the princes used aeroplanes as a way to show their modernity. They also used aeroplanes as a way to raise money. Right now, this aerodrome at Jodhpur was a very important aerodrome. People flew through it on their way from London to Australia. Remember, this is a time before aeroplanes can do like a 20-hour journey from one side of the world to the other. At this point in time, a journey from England to Australia takes 10 days by aeroplane, right? And you do not fly at night. So every day you basically make a short journey. You say fly from London to Paris, Paris to Germany, get off at Paris, spend the night in Paris, Paris to Milan, get off at Milan, spend the night in Milan, Milan to Malta, and so on and so forth, right? So Jodhpur is one of those stops. It's one of the places where aeroplanes stop, and that enables the state, Jodhpur, which is a poor state in natural resources, to raise money. Right now, I don't know how much money he was able to raise, partly because we've not been able to get those records. But it's quite clear that aeroplanes, like railways, like aerodromes, like railways, helped these states raise money. And so, when we talk about the princely states, we need to take into consideration the fact that aviation was a means of raising wealth, of establishing modernity, and so right. Then my fifth chapter is a chapter called Towards Sovereign Skies, Aviation in Independent India. This is a chapter about the last 5 years, of Indian aviation before nationalization, before essentially a very big change happens, in India. Very broadly, the chapter is divided into, three things happen at this point in time. Right. The first is that India signs a bunch of treaties with other countries, right? Like primarily with France, Britain, and the United States, to allow their aircraft to fly through India in return for allowing Indian aircraft to fly to their countries. There's a problem with these agreements, and that problem, very simply, is that India doesn't have enough aeroplanes to fly to their countries, which those countries have to fly to us, right? So it's fundamentally like an equal agreement. It's a bilateral agreement which says that, you can fly into our lands, we can fly into yours. But in practice, one side has aeroplanes and the other side doesn't. So because India is a relatively poor country, it's not able to basically follow up those agreements. Nevertheless, India makes very strict agreements with these countries saying that, look, you can't exploit us. We want equal rights. And even if we can't fulfill our demands today, we do want those equal rights for when we can eventually do it. So they sign a series of agreements. The second thing that happens in the 1950s is there's almost another war with Pakistan. Right? So in 1950, there's a huge showdown between India and Pakistan in Bengal, right? And again, relatively close to, I think, where most of you are talking to me from today, which is the Northeast. But essentially, there's a conflict about the rights of minorities. Hindus are increasingly being persecuted in Bangladesh, or what at that point in time will be called East Pakistan. So the Indian government sort of tries to force the Pakistani government to improve its treatment of minorities. So there's a big showdown between the Pakistani and Indian militaries. India puts a lot of military pressure on Pakistan at this point in time, and aeroplanes are a key component of that. Right? Like basically, aircraft will be used by India to say, look, you better behave, right? And the Pakistanis do end up signing an agreement. I think it's between Liaquat Ali Khan and Jawaharlal Nehru, called the Delhi Pact, where they say that minorities in both countries will be respected. But the lesson that the Pakistanis take away from this is that they need aeroplanes as well, right? That as long as India has the advantage in aviation, it will be able to strike East and West Pakistan. So Pakistan needs to have a strong air force, and basically the investments in that will increase after this 1950 confrontation between India and Pakistan. But the other thing that happens is that the most important thing is that airlines basically become completely indigenized in the sense, a case of the people operating them, right? So the Indian Air Force is completely taken over by Indians. 1953, 54, the final British officers depart from the Indian Air Force, right? They were sort of there to help with administration and things like that, while Indians learned the ropes for the highest positions, which they were not allowed to have before 1947. But they do depart, and what ends up happening is that basically the Indian aviation sectors nationalized in terms of civil aviation as well, right? So you can see this image of Nehru, Indira Gandhi, and a bunch of sort of leaders standing in front of an aeroplane. In the background, you can see again, classic Dakota aeroplane, the aeroplane of that time. On the side of the aircraft, the letters are VT. Even today, if you travel by aeroplane anywhere in India, look at what the number on the aeroplane is. Okay, the alphabets will always be VT. VT incidentally stands for Viceregal Territories, right? Because India was a viceregal territory, right? And that was the code that it received. After independence, we never really tried to get IN, which we should have. And then Indonesia became independent, right? So they were able to apply for and get IN. So, Indonesian airplanes now have the letters IN, and Indian airplanes in the year 2025, just as in the year 1947, have the letters VT written on them. But what's important, of course, over here is that by the 1950s, the government wanted to take over civil aviation, right? Now, part of the reason for this is because airline companies were just doing very, very badly. They were not very financially, well. There were lots and lots of airlines, so private companies were basically crashing and losing out all the money they had. So far, generally, that's been the story when we talk about privatization versus nationalization of airlines. That has been the story, that it was an economic decision. And of course, this is a politically somewhat controversial take, because even today there's a lot of debate about nationalization versus privatization. But let me just say that when India decided to nationalize its airlines, it did so in a context where everybody in the world was nationalizing it. Right? Like flag carriers, that is basically a national airline, was a common thing to have. People took pride in having a national airline, and it was a matter of pride to nationalize the airlines. More importantly, my argument is that the government of India, when it was nationalizing airlines, said it was doing this for a couple of reasons. Right? One was the economic reason, that the government was going to better sort of manage airline finances. Also, government was only body that had enough money to buy aeroplanes, right? Like aeroplanes are going to become bigger and more expensive in coming years, so airlines, should be controlled by government. But the other argument they made was that airlines needed to be controlled for security purposes, right? That the civil air aviation was important from a military perspective, as we saw in Kashmir, as was the case also in the Bengal crisis, as is the case in various other circumstances. It was important that the government have control of civil as well as military aviation for dealing with national emergencies. Right now, that argument by the government has never been taken seriously by academics. Right. One second. So far, generally, when we talk about nationalization, the debate has always been, no, the government just said, security, cited security concerns for the sake of taking over the airlines. They were socialists. They wanted to do it, blah, blah, blah. But I'm hoping that this presentation has convinced you that aeroplanes did play an important role in India's national security. They did play a role, especially in Kashmir. They also played a role in the Bengal crisis. So it wasn't unnatural for the government to see them as a national security asset and to try to take over them in that sense. And that's precisely what ended up happening. Broadly, what are the conclusions of my book? One is that the aeroplane played a very important role in transforming India, from British colony to sovereign republic. I don't want to overstate this. In certain ways, what happened with the airplane was happening in other sectors, sectors like railways, sectors like dams, engineering, the civil services, all of which had a very huge impact. But I'm just trying to say that insofar as they had an impact, The impact was small. Aeroplanes had an impact. They had a small impact, but it's a very important impact, for Indian aviation. The other thing is that the study of the aeroplane is reflective of the numerous ways in which sovereignty was constructed and contested. Right? For Indian politicians, from the very beginning, the idea was India needs to have an air force. If India does not have an air force, it can't be free, because if the British leave but we don't have an air force, maybe the Japanese or Russians will take us over. On the other hand, if India has an air force, even if the British don't leave, India will actually become free because it will be able to defend itself, right? The other contenders for power also saw it the same way, right? Muhammad Ali Jinnah met with Mirza Isfahani to immediately try and get Pakistan an airline, right? Which is how PIA eventually will be formed. It starts out as Orient Airways, eventually becomes PIA, Pakistan International Airways. And he also invested heavily in getting an air force, right? Liaquat Ali Khan, who was kind of going to become Muhammad Ali Jinnah's successor, he focused very heavily on getting airlines too, getting Pakistan an air force, even if it was a small air force, even if it was going to have very few aircraft to begin with, he did so. And of course, the princes also wanted free countries, right? Jodhpur, like Hyderabad, like Mysore, wanted to, after the British left, become an independent state. Right? They were not particularly keen on becoming part of an Indian Union, one that would replace, control from London with control from Delhi, at least in certain senses of the term. So they also invested heavily in aircraft, and the idea that aeroplanes might help them achieve some form of independence was a pretty strong idea at this point in time. Finally, I'd like to point out that India is actually a case study for most countries in the world, right? Like when we talk about the history of aviation, if you sort of Google books on this, you'll find 90% of the books are about like 6 or 7 countries, right? So America, Germany, France, Japan. But the fact is that these are a very small proportion of the overall number of countries, right? And that's because most of the countries have these small, relatively sort of small number of countries have a large number of aircraft. However, the largest number of countries in the world have very small numbers of aircraft, right? Like if you look at the fleets of countries like Peru and Egypt, they are comparable in certain ways to the fleets that India historically had, or at least started out with, right? So in certain ways, the same story that we see playing out in India, where you start out with a nationalist movement, you nationalize airlines, the nationalized airline doesn't do so well, you then privatize the airline. You try to sort of indigenize aircraft production. You try to build your own warplanes at home. Those aeroplanes don't end up sort of working out. You eventually become importer of aircraft from the West, or the Russians. All of these stories are pretty common, and they happen across the board. Right? So what I've tried to do is I've tried to tell the Indian version of this story, which is much more representative of the overall global story than the story of more elite, wealthy, predominantly Western countries, right? So before I stop, I'll just once again very quickly go through the images. I understand you've mostly missed them, but just for your own reference, I'll just very quickly go through those images which you might have missed. This is the first image which I think you might have seen, which is the one of J.R.D. Tata. This is the second image of the Westland Wapiti aircraft, which I was telling you about, the Wapiti aircraft, which was not the most successful aeroplane in the world, but certainly the first which the Indian Air Force had. This is an image of aerodrome construction during World War II. You can see a sort of bare-chested man digging the ground in front of a very big aeroplane. This is an image of the Indian Independence Day celebrations, which I told you about: the Red Fort, the blue Indian Air Force, and on top of it, the large, presumably Royal Air Force planes. This is the image of Partition, right, where you can see the wing of the aeroplane almost, in the right. Let me see. I think you can see the mouse moving. Yeah, you can sort of see the wing of the aeroplane from which this image is taken. This is the Ittihad Mein Shakti image which I told you about, the squadron number 1's motto and its coat of arms. This is the image of the of the sort of Indian Army disembarking from civil airlines in Kashmir, in 1947 to sort of secure Srinagar airport. This is the basis in certain ways of Indian presence in Kashmir. This is an Indian pilot getting into sort of, an Indian fighter plane. I presume it's a Tempest. Tempests were the main planes of this point in time. Used in this particular war. It was a mainline fighter of the Indian Air Force at that point in time. And of course, I think from the Umed pictures onwards, you ended up sort of being able to catch up with what I was talking about. So anyway, that brings my talk to an end. I hope it's been somewhat engaging and somewhat coherent. I'm happy to take any questions or queries that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for that very, very insightful lecture. If anyone has any questions, they can type in the chat box. We have been getting some questions from Facebook and YouTube channels. I shall put the first one. I shall read it out.
Yeah.
To what extent did the integration of aviation technology in colonial and post-colonial India function not as a tool of national integration or progress?
Your camera. I've been looking at a blank screen all the
Sorry, sir. Sorry,
Yeah.
sir. I completely forgot about it. Sorry, sir. Should I begin?
Yeah.
To what extent did the integration of aviation technology in colonial and post-colonial India function not as a tool of national integration or progress, but as an elite-driven spatial project that reconfigured social hierarchies and deepened the disconnect between state developmental narratives and ground-level mobilities?
Look, I completely disagree with the premise of this question, right? And this is a classic issue that I've been facing through much of my research, which is that when we do history, and I'm talking purely from a historical perspective, we have tended to try and privilege the perspective of what has been called in historical terms the subaltern perspective, right? The perspective of those below. But that is an awkward position to take. Why? Firstly, because poor people have very limited agency in their own lives. Decisions are made by elite groups, right? The lines between India and Pakistan were drawn by elite men. The decision to partition the country, which had a huge impact on subaltern groups, which had a huge impact on the poor, on women. Those decisions were made on polished tables in London and Delhi. Right. So when we sort of look at aviation and we talk about it from the perspective of a disconnect between aviation and development, the fact of the matter is no, aviation absolutely contributed to development, and technology absolutely contributes to development. Right? Like when we take a position that we have to sort of all development has to be fundamentally democratized, we lose out our chance to participate in the wider sort of wider human history and wider human body, right? I mean, like just to give you an example, I'm constantly asked when I was abroad, I was constantly asked, why is India sort of sending up space rockets when it's a poor country? Why doesn't it focus on its poor? And I say, why can't it focus on both those things? Do poor people, do poor countries not deserve to have space rockets? Do we not deserve to have satellites that will enable us to talk about, to look at what our geographical conditions are, what our agricultural conditions are? It absolutely helps poor people to have poorer countries to have high technology, which can improve the lives of their people, right? There is certainly something to be said for inequality in India, for the ways in which state decision making has been, often, unjust. But I refuse to accept the premise overall about looking at, things like aviation or space exploration as purely elite projects which have no real impact on the poor and which don't fundamentally improve their lives in myriad ways. So that's my response.
Right, sir. Ayush has raised a hand. Ayush, could you unmute yourself and put your question?
Thank you. Thank you, Srijani. Thank you, sir, for your wonderful lecture and it's very insightful lecture. And just today morning, I just read out your book because it's in our library. I'm from
Nice.
Shillong, Partition University. So I was reading the book, but I am just very typical medieval guy. I am master's I'm
Right,
doing my
right.
master's in medieval India. So just reading through your book, I have just one comment about one question, and now I'm just listening your talks, and I just have the urge to ask this question, sir. How does the invocation of the term modern in the making of modern India,
Mhm.
when examined through the material and symbolic trajectory of the aeroplane,
Yeah.
reveal the ontological violence of modernity itself, wherein the privileging of flight as a metaphor or an instrument of national progress, non-linear temporalities, vernacular life worlds, and the modes of becoming, all while masking its own historical and contingency under the illusion of inevitability, sir.
I mean, that's a fascinating question, but my answer is going to resemble the previous answer I gave, which is quite simply that yeah, absolutely, violence is the center of modernity. But like, I'm highly doubtful that the medieval period was a, I mean, I understand in relative terms it was relatively more peaceful, but I don't think violence has ever not been at the center of social organization. Right? Like violence is a means by which we organize society and politics. It has always been. And I personally, like if you were to talk to the leaders of the 1940s and 50s, if you were to talk to Mao Zedong, you were to talk to Stalin, you were to talk to Nehru, they would, to a greater or less extent, absolutely sanction violence in order to modernize what they saw as non-modern people. And if anything, the state of science in India being what it is, the state of technology in India being what it is, indicates that there were the amounts of the adequateness of state violence in India, for the purposes, for the project of modernity has been, has been lacking, right? So I absolutely think that is it contingent? Yeah, it sure is. But the process of modernity is not going to be a painless one. And control of aircraft, which is my core idea, control of aircraft, played a key role in enabling the state to impose that kind of violence. What kind of life world would we have if we talk about the peasant life world, their sort of circular time. What kind of world would we have if the state was not able to bring in fighter aircraft to stop, farmers in Punjab from murdering each other? Right? I don't think that's some kind of glorious, utopia to which we need to return. Ambedkar was quite clear on this. If you don't particularly like Stalin or Nehru, you can think about Ambedkar, and he said that violence was absolutely necessary in order to pull India into modernity against its own consent if needed.
Thank you.
Yes, that's my answer.
Okay, so the next question is by Shanton. How did the symbolic and infrastructural incorporation of the airplane into the Indian nationalist imagination obscure the violent displacements, technocratic exclusions, and militaristic surveillance regimes necessary for its operation, thereby masking coercion under the guise of modernity?
So the first thing aeroplanes were used for was bombing the northwest frontier, right? And that was because undivided India, was directly faced the tribesmen of the northwestern frontier, right? And again, I'd like to emphasize, a common theme that's emerging across questions here is the idea that the Indian leadership was masking violence or averse to violence, but Indian elites were absolutely committed to violence because they lived in a world that had been created by violence. Most of them had lived through the 19th century. They had seen the famines that had been caused because of colonial violence in South Asia, and they had lived through World War One, which was, as you know, a humongously violent event. So for them, the question was not about masking violence. It was not about hiding state coercion. It was about establishing a powerful state which could coerce uh, tribesmen on its borders, as well as unruly rioters within, as well as expansionist neighbors, to respect sovereignty. Right, sovereignty is indifferentiable from violence. There is no non-violent sovereignty in South Asia. Right, like an interesting thing about this whole work is Gandhi almost, at least in the first draft of this book, Gandhi almost did not feature right? Now, that is not to say that Mahatma Gandhi was not an important person. Obviously, he's a hugely important historical personality. We'll probably be studying the life and works of Mahatma Gandhi a couple of hundred years from now, long after we stopped looking at other leaders and other states. But the wider point I'd like to make is the consensus across Indian elites about the importance and use of violence. I don't understand why we need to be squeamish about this, because they certainly were not. They did not live in a world that was not shaped by violence, and they absolutely saw violence as a prerequisite for sovereignty. Indians could not. What did the aeroplane represent? Right, the aeroplane represented bombing. The aeroplane represented terror. The aeroplane represented gas attacks. The aeroplane eventually came to represent atomic bomb attacks. If India was not able to do these things, it would be victim of these things. Right? That is the colonial binary. That is the position from which the Indian leadership was coming. So absolutely, they were committed to it. There was consensus across the board. If you asked Indian leaders from left or right, or socialists, Janata Party, not Janata, Hindu Mahasabha, they would all basically agree about the importance of violence. It's just the question of who controls said violence, and that's where the aeroplane comes in. That's where state policy comes in. And it is important to have a strong state that's capable of dispersing the most modern forms of violence.
So the next question is coming in from YouTube. It's placed by Orno. How does the aeroplane, as both a technological artifact and a metaphor of sovereignty in the making of modern India, become a site of epistemic violence and mimicry in the post-colonial condition, wherein the nation-state, in aspiring towards the sky of Western modernity, reenacts the colonial gaze through its spatial practices, thus reinscribing imperial cartographies under the illusion of indigenous ascent?
Well, two things, right? One is modernity was and is universal, right? I mean, reproducing colonial practices does not make them colonial, right? Like, essentially, unless, my wider question would be, should we disband the IAS? Should we be done with using English? Should we sort of give up on the university? The very institution which has brought us all over here, just because they initially sort of began in the West. Whether we are talking about electoral politics, whether we are talking about clubs and associations, unions, democracy, these are all ideas that may have begun in the West, but to essentially claim that they reinscribe colonial practices when they have been completely absorbed by Indians, I think is a naive position at best. But that said, what I will say is quite simply that, in terms of continuities between the colonial and post-colonial state, if you are looking at the ways in which the British and the Indians have continued to conduct business, there are people who are alive today who were alive when the British were ruling India. Right? And in historical terms, that's a remarkably short period of time. Now, India's independence was not scored in a revolution. Right? India's independence was scored through a series of things, including a long nationalist movement, world historical events like World War II, things like that. So our approach to governance has been an iterative rather than a revolutionary approach. However, even if you look at revolutionary states, if you look at Tsarist Russia or Maoist China, Stalinist Russia or Maoist China, it's not as though those states were able to completely break free from the colonial practices of their predecessors, right? So we need to just sort of think about these things also from the perspective of historical continuity. 70 years is a very short time. 70, 80 years is a very short time. People are still alive who remember colonial rule. It was not likely that the Indian state was going to be radically different in certain ways. The big difference, of course, is things like planning, things like the fact that your resources are no longer being taken abroad. But they were absolutely going to reinscribe colonial cartographies and colonial images. Because my question is, what is the alternative? Right? If you look at Nehu, if you look at Shillong, you look at things like that, what do we as Indians all have in common? Right? Do we share a common religion? Do we share a common language? Do we share a common ethnicity? No. What the two things we share in common? One is a constitution that we are all bound to obey, and the other is territorial lines that we ourselves didn't necessarily draw. Once you start being willing to change those territorial lines, you have to ask the question of what being Indian essentially then means, right? And what that means for people who are living in what is India's periphery, right? Which is, I mean, fair if those are ideas you want to engage with, that's totally fair. But if you'd like to do a whole-scale reinscription of the cartographies of colonialism, the consequences are not always going to be consequences that we will find acceptable.
Okay, so the next question, Rakhi has placed the next question in the chat box. I shall read it
She can
out.
ask me herself, right? Like she's here. Is she this Rakhi?
Rakhi, are you here? Sir, I don't think. I think she might be having some technical
Okay, no
problems.
worries. Go ahead.
Yes, sir, I am
I'm
here.
reading.
So,
Oh, okay. Rakhi, can you put the question to him?
Oh, okay. Wait. In
Yeah,
what
sure.
you want to turn on your camera, Rakhi, if it's working. Otherwise, no pressure.
am I audible, sir?
Yeah, you are.
In what ways did the discourse of aerial modernity in India, from Nehruvian vision to neoliberal aviation reforms, actively marginal alternative epistemologies of space, time, and connectivity, particularly those rooted in indigenous and subaltern experience of mobility and aspiration?
Okay, sure. I mean, see, if you look at the story of places like Peru, right, there also notions of time were reinscribed because of the arrival of aircraft. But my wider question is always the same, right? Like, what is the alternative? Like, if we look at railways, like Gandhi didn't incidentally say a lot about aeroplanes. I searched extensively to see what he had to say about aircraft. He did not talk a whole lot about aircraft, except in certain contexts. But the wider point is that Gandhi was initially himself against railways because he felt that they changed your perception of time quite radically. Right? That it diluted your sense of time. It didn't give your body, and mind a chance to adjust to being in a completely different space. But just the wider question is, so what? Right? Like, I mean, if we do not have these forms of mobility, if we do not have railways, if we do not have aircraft, then how do we achieve any level of human progress? Right? I mean, quite simply, we need to meet other people. We need to go to places where we don't live. Many of you have probably flown or taken a train to Shillong. So, I mean, are you then implicated in the process of modernity, in the epistemic violence, as many of you like to call it, of modernity, or is it that aircraft have provided you with opportunities that you would otherwise simply not have, or railways have provided you with opportunities that you otherwise simply not have? So yes, time changes, our perceptions of time change, and when space travel happens, presumably those perceptions, which incidentally I don't expect to happen anytime soon, but our perceptions of time will again shift. But my wider question is, yeah, so what is the alternative? Do we give up on it? Do we start walking again? Is it a act of is it an act of progress or kindliness to sort of go back to horse-drawn carriages? Because I've looked at how life used to be before these forms of transportation arrived, and it was not pleasant. It took 3 months to travel to England by steamship. It took 5 days to travel between Bombay and Pune. If the journeys took that long, most of you simply wouldn't make them. Right? Even right now, I recently read that 87% of Indians die in the district in which they are born. Right? So, yeah, we think that we're living in a world of unprecedented mobility, and yeah, there's certainly an environmental series of questions to be asked about the impact of things like aviation. But the wider question is quite simply that, I mean, do we deny people the opportunities that mobility provides because of the shifts that it produces in terms of disjunctures in time? I don't think that's a valid argument to be made, and I certainly don't think we are living that life to make said happen. Srijani?
Yes, sir. So that was our last question. This was a wonderful experience listening to you. This was very accessible as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah. No, I was just saying
We
thank
hope
you.
to we hope to see you again in our lecture series.
No, thank you so much. These are all very smart questions. I think we disagree because of the perspectives that we have, but I think they were very smart and very well-phrased questions. I hope you were able to get something from the presentation, and thank you again for having me. All right, bye.
Bye,
Thank
bye,
you.
sir.